Poets are going to be available next door to sign their books at the book point. I welcome you to the plenary session of day 2. Hereby, the sessions will come to an end, followed by the events in the evening at Shaheen Block once we're finished here, probably by about 5:30, 5:45, and 6:30 we will carry on with the, I make a mistake, sorry, by 5:45 we will begin, and 6:30 will be the concert at the amphitheater of Hyderabad Public School, which is at the back. A group from Bombay Bairag, will be performing. I have immense pleasure and joy to have Sanjana Kapoor here with us. Sanjana is a theatre person, a film person, an educator, somebody whose journey has been quite interestingly, naturally molded by her own family in theatre. As they say that she has had in her mother's milk through Jennifer Kendall the seeds of theatre, as she did from her father and both families. And she has carried this torch forward. We know that Prithvi Theatre in Mumbai was quasi-resurrected by her, a theatre of the family, and she brought it to life and has become a very important center for theatre in the country. Likewise, an event, a movement quasi of Junoon. I call it a movement because it is education, it is theatre, it's theatrics in different forms, which takes to children, to adults, to really bring out different concepts of theatre in India and abroad. She brings various groups to visit the country, and Junoon brings them around. We hope that someday we will bring Junoon to Hyderabad in a big way as well. This particular plenary session, and I will hand it over to her because we are all assembled here to not only hear Sanjana and her journey, but this is part of the tribute that Hyderabad Literary Festival pays. We began this feature last year. This year we are commemorating 4 personalities, one of them being the late Shashi Kapoor. I request Sanjana to take through the journey of her life, the Junoon of the Kapoors and the Kendals.
Goodness, I've been through such a whirlwind of a day today. And I mean, that performance, I'm not sure I can quite match up to it. I'm sorry, so bear with me. But Amita's been after me for many, many years to come, and finally I'm here. And I said, but I don't write. I'm not a book person. I read. But in any case, here I am, perhaps sharing with you some of the books that my family has created. And there are 2 of them, and I'll talk about them in the course of this conversation with you. But what I will do is, yes, stand here before you and share the passion, the Junoon, the inspiration that led my father to do what he did in theatre, and therefore led me as well to do what I do in theatre. My 1944, you can imagine what the country was going through. Prithvi Kapoor was a well-established film star, and in fact possibly one of the only people, I'm not sure, I'm just guessing, but possibly only the only person in the world who has made that transition from the silent era, black and white film, to the color film, to the talkies, and that's quite extraordinary. But he realized his passion, and he breathed life into his dream, which was theatre, in 1944, at the height of his film stardom. And why? Because he felt that that was the only direct way in which he could actually reach people. he couldn't do it through cinema. And so he created theatre and he toured with his theatre company, Prithvi Theatres, with an S at the end of it. He toured with Prithvi Theatres for 16 years, taking theatre across the country. And if you look at the map of the places he went to, it's extraordinary. Urban theatre from Bombay or Delhi or Bangalore would hardly go to. If they were persuaded, they would go to places like Bikaner or Vizag or various smaller cities. But he went everywhere. He went wherever there was an audience, and there were lots and lots of audiences. And what did he do? He took theatre that he believed had to talk to the people about the nation that was about to be born. And so his plays were written for him, and they spoke about, they predicted partition. They talked about the Hindu-Muslim tensions that could arise. They talked about the role of the artist in our society, talked about what money is going to do to the new Indian, and a whole array of different subjects that he felt were desperately needed to talk about. And in 1944, if I've got my maths right, my father was about 5 or 6 or 7. What? I think he was born in 39. So what does that make him? 5 or 6. I think he was about 5 or 6. And he actually was in the first play that Prithvi Kapoor put up. The first play was very unusual. It came about in a different sort of way. And luckily it didn't have a very long run because it was a huge set. It was Shakuntala. And the set took 3 hours the play was about 5 hours long because in between the 3 sets, it took hours. It was a fiasco. It was a disaster. But I think that's what I've also learned from my family, and that's the DNA or the genetic disorder that I have inherited, which is no matter how big a disaster you do, just carry on and do another one, and finally it'll be okay. So in fact, it's interesting because when 6 years ago we started Junoon, my colleague and I, and we tried to emulate what I was doing at Prithvi Theatre, which I had started for 21 years, which was a summertime program with children, and we tried to emulate it with Junoon without actually taking into consideration our reality. We were not Prithvi Theatre, we were Junoon. Who knew about Junoon? And it was a fiasco. There were hardly any children that came to these workshops. Nobody knew about them. They couldn't find the place. And I met a friend, a colleague, a well-wisher, not a colleague, an acquaintance, in the bus at the airport to the aeroplane. And he said, "So how was it? How was it?" And I said, "Oh my God, it was a disaster." And his face fell. And he was in a state of complete shock. And he was appalled that I could say this. And I was smiling. And I was saying, yes, it was a disaster. And we're going to learn from it. And we did, I think. So if it had been a success or a mediocre success, I think we wouldn't have learned anything. We would have continued doing something quite wrong. So my father grew up with this atmosphere of a traveling theatre company. Both his brothers were in and out of the theatre company. Raj Kapoor would create the music as well for the theatre. He would design the lights, and my father learned how to design lights from Raj Kapoor. Many years later, and I'm going to keep going like this, okay? I'm going to ping pong between years. Many, many years later, in fact, during one of our summertime at Prithvi Theatre programs, these workshops were short, process-based workshops for children to use their hands and to do things and discover their own imagination and creativity. And I thought it was essential and very necessary. Also to develop an audience, that was the real reason, but I knew it was going to shift something in that little child. And one of the workshops was by Arvind Gupta, who's just getting a Padma Award. I was so thrilled yesterday to hear this, or day before. And Arvind Gupta is this ingenious scientist who creates toys out of waste material, and he teaches children the basic elements of science in a wonderful way. And my father came, as he would religiously do. He'd come to every single workshop ending day and hand out the certificates. He was a tremendous support. But as much as he was a support, he was a critic too. And I would dread his criticism because he would be bang on. And very often he would not quite realize where he was telling me whatever he had to tell me. So he came in, and of course wearing his traditional white kurta and white trousers, so it was slightly obvious that he'd walked into the room. And there was this tiny little room in a school we were working in, and there were these kids, doing all these sort of things with bobs and ends and creating stuff. And he sat there and he said very loudly, he said, "What is this to do with theatre?" And my heart just, I wanted to die. I wanted the earth to separate and for me to be sucked in, and I just wanted to vanish. And there were all the parents sitting around and all the children and Arvind Gupta, and I was like, "Papa, shush, just, I'll talk to you later. Okay, we'll talk about it later." And he watched, and he was presented what each child had created and what they'd made. And at the end of it, he said, "Yes, you're absolutely right. This has everything to do with theatre." Because he told me stories of how he would make lights out of dalda tins. And he would put them up in places like this, which was a stage made up out of nothing, and create theatre. And that's what we have to do. We have to create a generation of theatre makers who can make theatre, literally make it with their hands, whether it's making pulleys. I mean, you ask a theatre wala today to put up a curtain with a pulley system, and they'll say, "We don't know how to do pulleys," but you have to know how to do pulleys in a theatre. So luckily that battle I won with my dad. But when he finished his matriculation, which is what it was in those days, he just automatically joined Prithvi Theatres. He was never going to go into university or college. The academics has never been a big thing in my family. So much so that it's a very, very weird scenario that we're almost proud of the fact that we don't do university. It's not what we do. We barely pass exams. It's fine. And I have a 15-year-old son, and I'm thinking, no, I want him to go to university. I think it's a good idea. I think it's nice. I don't know anything about it. I've never been, but I think he should go. Anyway, and my father was very boastful about the fact that he was a failed matriculate, or whatever. And it was only a few years ago, literally about 10 or 15 years ago, that I found out it was a complete lie. I mean, it was a technical truth, but it was a lie. He got distinction in mathematics, which was astonishing. And he did really well in every subject, and he failed because he failed in Sanskrit. And I never knew this. And he carried this sort of flag of being a great failure. And I thought, no, you're a hoax. You're actually quite smart. But anyway, but when he joined Prithvi Theatres, he was the third assistant stage manager or something. He had to clean the stage and put up the lights and look out of the curtain to see if the audience has gathered in and are seated. And slowly he got roles. He got speaking roles very, very slowly. The plays were always centered around Prithvi Kapoor, so he was always the lead, and he had these magnificent cast of actors that were with him. And in fact, I learned so much more about the real story of Prithvi Theatres in 2006 when we celebrated my grandfather's birth centenary. And it was only because of my father. He had been pestering me for 3 years before that, saying, "Remember, 2006, we have to do something. Whatever it is, but we have to do something." And he kept at me consistently. He didn't wake up like we usually do in our country. The last minute, the government would say, "Oh my God, it's a big, important centenary year. Let's do something." And he kept on and on and on. And that's how we actually created an exhibition. We did research, and we created an exhibition, and then from that, a little yearbook called Kala Desh Ki Seva Mein, which was Prithvi Kapoor's motto. It was his theatre's motto, and he believed very, very strongly in it. And we created a festival that was based all around that, and it was fascinating for me to hear these stories from his actors who were still alive, and we had our team of researchers that would travel around the country finding them and getting their stories about the life of that traveling theatre company, and how do they live, and what do they do. And it was rigorous. I mean, every morning, 9 o'clock, they were rehearsing. They would just do riyaz for 2 hours, whether it was reciting poetry, making sure you had the right breath, and how you would move on stage, and then rehearsing. And then, fortunately, at some point in time in their travels, they came across a moment in time in Calcutta, which is why Calcutta is so special in my heart. There was another theatre company. This theatre company was made up of 15 people called Shakespeareana. tiny little company compared to Prithvi Theatres, which was about 150 people that would travel in 3 bogies across the country. Shakespeareana was 14 people, and this was my grandparents, my British grandparents. And they fell in love with India when they had come during the war, or before the war, to entertain the forces with something called ENSA. And it was entertainment for the forces, and they traveled across Burma, Southeast Asia, but India was my grandfather's passion and love. And this is where he wanted to be. And my mother says something beautiful. I don't know where she said this, but she wrote, I think she was trying to begin to start to write a book. But she says this, and I'm going to read what she said. She said, in my birth certificate, this is my mother, in my birth certificate, my father was described as an actor of no fixed abode. I always found this romantic and something to be intensely proud of. My first memories are of the smell of grease paint, dust, the perspiration of terrified actors. And I wish she'd finished that book because it would have been really interesting, but she didn't. But my grandfather did. And so this is Geoffrey Kendall's book, which talks about his years in theatre, even before India, and then his years in India and what India meant to him. And there is another book which I didn't bring with me, which is my aunt's book, Felicity Kendall, and that's called White Cargo, and that talks about her years. So what did this crazy, wonderful man do? And he is my inspiration. What did he do? He fell in love with this country, and he had managed to book one show, just one show, I think it was in Gwalior. And he pulled together a group of actors in England, and they lived in the Lake District, and he pulled together a group of actors and said, we're going to India. And they trusted him, and they said, okay. And you can imagine, it's I think post-war, and tough time in England. Anyway, it's grey and dribbly and nasty weather. And then, of course, there's, depression after the war. So people were quite happy to go on this adventure. But he came to India with one show booked, 2 weeks on a ship. And he went to my mother's school, and this is somewhat why education is sort of looked at upon differently. We sort of have a different view of education in my family. He went to my mother's school, and she was 13, and he spoke to the principal, and he said, we need to take Jennifer out of school for 1 year. Is that okay? We promised to bring her back. And the principal said, why? And he said, well, we have to go to India. And the principal said, my goodness, what better education. Take her. My mother never went back to school. Never. So this is the strange thing about my family. I remember many, many years later, I was in the 8th standard. And actually some years before the 8th standard, when I was 12, I must have been in the 7th standard, not many years, but how old are you? 12 in the 7th standard. One summer had a long break, and I had gone and worked with my grandparents in Ireland. We went to schools in Ireland and did scenes from Shakespeare, and I loved it. And it was just such an adventure to sit in the back of this Citroen, tiny little yellow Citroen that my grandfather drove. It would drive me mad at 10 kilometers an hour. But we had our costumes and our tiny little set, which was nothing but a folding chair and our makeup and Shakespeare. And that was our companion, and that's what we did. So the following year, when I was suddenly faced in my school with this horrendous dilemma of having to face serious academics, because my school was very sort of casual about studies till then. They just thought, okay, you'll get through, you're fine, you can do a bit of theater here and there. And they would focus on the ones who really wanted to study, and they'd ignore me. And suddenly 8th standard happened, or 9th standard was going to happen, and I was terrified. And I told my mother, I said, I can't do this. I'm going to fail, and I can't repeat a year. It's too boring. I'm not going to do this. And she looked straight at me, and she said, what will you do? And I said, I'll work with my grandparents. She said, okay, if you fail, you work with your grandparents. If you don't fail, you finish your education. And I didn't fail. So I'm not sure whether that's a good thing or not. But the only good thing about that was that we had, the one positiveness about it was we had a choice between economics and art, and I chose art, of course. I loved my art teacher. So for me, that was one happy outcome of that strange circumstance. But that was the kind of family I grew up in. And So in Calcutta, flashback, Calcutta, my father is third assistant manager looking through the curtain to see if the actors have, if the audience has all come in. And in the first row, he sees this gorgeous woman. And there is just total love. His 18-year-old little heart goes dug, 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 dug. He's only 18. He's a baby, right? And what it was Shakespeareana, this whole company of 15 actors who were sitting in the first row, had come to Calcutta to perform. And they were told very graciously by the manager of that theatre, but I'm sorry, we can't really allow you to perform for another week because we have a super hit performance and we've extended the date. And it was Prithvi Theatre's show of Diwar, and it was many of their shows. I think it was Diwar and Ghaddar and Kalakar, a whole bunch of shows. So every night the Shakespeareana would come and watch the shows. Of course, they knew, my grandparents knew of each other. They had met each other before, but my father had never met them. And so he mustered up enough courage with his friend to go up and ask my mother out for, I don't know, a Coca-Cola or something. And later, a few weeks later, they met again in Bombay. And at this time, he took her to the Opera House, which is where they would rehearse. And the Opera House has just been resurrected and is extremely beautiful. And that too was a place that I've always felt very affectionate towards, because I know that's where my parents courted each other. My mother was 4 years older than my dad. And I think very soon in her life, she realized, you're the one. I'm not letting go of you. This poor 18-year-old. So he traveled. He finally joined Shakespeareana. And he traveled with that company for 2 years. And can you imagine, he was a Don Bosco boy. He went to Don Bosco school, speaking English, but Bombaya English, whatever, Don Bosco English. And he had to get his tongue around Shakespeare. He wrote in his diary somewhere how terrifying it was, his first show. He just that nothing came out the way it had to. His tongue turned to leather or to iron or something horrendous, and he was terrified. But my grandmother was a fantastic trainer, and they too would do riyaz every morning. And it would be all about all these voice exercises and things that he hadn't quite done in Prithvi Theatre. So he learned a very different art of making theatre in Shakespeareana. And Shakespeareana, I think, was a little bit ahead of its time, actually. They were quite modern. Their stage was very bare, and just certain elements of suggestiveness about what the set was. And that's what Shakespeare always wanted anyway, right? Because you were supposed to do the work with him. Your magnificent audience was supposed to work with Shakespeare's words to make up this world that was going to come alive on stage. And so a beautiful thing that my father also, and I said this last time I was in Hyderabad, is that I saw him when I was doing the research for my grandfather's centenary. I found my father's diaries, and he wrote a note, and he said, we just performed in this amazing university theatre. I have to go back tomorrow and take photographs. It was the most beautiful theatre I've ever seen, and it was in Vizag. And I hope tomorrow I'm going to see some photographs of this theatre, because some wonderful, kind gentleman is going to show them to me. But I'm dying to go back and see this theatre. Apparently it still exists in Vizag. So that was the life of my father. That's what he wanted. He wanted to have a life in theatre. And imagine that, with my mother, him and she working together, not only doing Shakespeare, doing Bernard Shaw, Noel Coward, modern classics. This was the life he wanted. But I guess very soon, when children started appearing, realities had to shift. And he had to make that terrible choice of moving to cinema. I don't think it was terrible, but he had to make the tough choice. And he never looked back, sadly. He never managed to do theatre and cinema like Nasir does so wonderfully. And that is my sorrow. I wish he had. My grandfather, Geoffrey Kendall, was furious with my mother. Furious. And he used to really, really be mad at her, because he said, you've built one of the most beautiful theatres in the world, the Prithvi Theatre, and you won't perform in it? How foolish can you be? And she just kept saying, no, I don't want people to think that I've built the theatre for me. I haven't built it for me, and I'm not going to act in it, which I think is ridiculous. But anyway, my grandparents performed at Prithvi Theatre, and I've performed at Prithvi Theatre a little bit, and so has Kunal. But it is a beautiful theatre. And in fact, it was when, so I'm going back and forth in time, as you must have realized. So when Felicity Kendall, I think it was in the 90s, when my grandfather got a stroke. And in the 90s, I don't know when exactly. And he got and this man who'd been on the move all his life, never stopping, an adventurer who would tell me the most fantastic stories about their travels and their audiences and how they lived and what they did. He got a stroke and he was paralyzed, and he was in a nursing home in London, and it was the toughest thing for my aunt. My mother had already passed away when I was 16, many years earlier. But my aunt had to take care of him, and it was a really, really tough proposition for her. And she came upon a fantastic way of coping. She opened up his Olivetti typewriter, which he always carried with him everywhere he went, because that's how he would write his letters. Nobody can read his handwriting. His handwriting was horrible. So all he would say at the bottom was, "God bless us all," and Jeffrey. But he would type his letters, and I still have his letters. He would type everything. And so she started typing on his typewriter her book, her story. And it was almost as if it was her ode or her homage back to him for the life he gave her. And in fact, ironically enough, he passed away 2 or 3 days after she completed the book. And it's really quite spine-chilling how these things work. But oh God, I don't know why I was telling you that story. My mind has suddenly gone blank. But I was telling you about it for a reason. She had to do some research as well. So she was going through some of her letters and things from my parents and from people in India. And she found a letter. And I was already working at Prithvi Theatre by then. I started in 1991, slowly doing small things. And she found a letter from my mother to her saying, "Shashi's gone mad. He wants to build a theatre." And to that point, I always thought it was my mother's idea. I never thought it was his idea. He was just so busy. In the 70s, he was called Taxi Kapoor. You know, he'd be doing 3 shoots a day, 4 shoots a day. I remember I was 8 or 9 years old, and we'd be making these long treks to Juhu, where Prithvi we lived the other end of town. And I would ask him, okay, just to make conversation, so Dad, tell me the story of your film you're working on. And he'd have to make it up. He didn't know. He was working in 4 films at the same time. Half the films didn't have scripts that were written. And I remember growing up, I think my parents really kept us quite protected from the world of the filmy dunya and from stardom. And they did it. It was a conscious decision. They did not want us to be star children. From the school they chose to send us to, from the life in Goa that they gave us, which for me was the biggest gift my parents ever gave me. When I was 3 years old, we had a home in Goa and would spend 3 months a year there. I used to know Konkani. I don't anymore. We took my dad's ashes there, and we went back to the beach where we lived, and the fishermen took us in their boat, and I went with my girlfriends from my childhood who I still know and I'm in touch with. And it was just like going back home. It was really, really beautiful. And they didn't accept us very easily. They're very proud, beautiful fishermen, and they didn't care they didn't even know who my dad was. And it took a while. It took almost a year for them to really accept us. And then when they did accept us, when my father very often would only come for 2 or 3 days holiday, but we would spend a whole month there, a fisherman would always sleep on our veranda, taking care of us. We wouldn't know. We'd wake up sometimes and find him there. But that's what they did. They just took us into their fold and said, "We're going to protect you." But for me, that life and that experience has molded a lot of my personality and who I am. And I'm sad that I haven't given anything remotely similar to my son, who's 15. And it's a struggle for me. I haven't been able to find it. And it really, really is a struggle. But that was the greatest gift my parents gave me. Prithvi Kapoor died when I was 5, so I hardly knew him. But I think what my father grew up with from Prithvi Kapoor was a very clear idea that you give back to society what you get. It was very simple. And so there was no question. You had to give back in whatever way you possibly could. So my father then put his money back into films that he believed were good. With the films he produced, he put money into the basic building of Prithvi Theatre and the buying of that land, etc. And I think that is something that I also learned from my father, or at least a little bit. I don't do it as much as he did, but I do believe that we all have to be connected. And Prithvi Kapoor, in fact, was a member of parliament. He was nominated twice by the president. So for 8 years, he was a member of parliament. And I went and did, when we were doing research on him, I went to the parliament, the Rajya Sabha archive, and it's the most wonderful archive. If you haven't been, you should go. They wouldn't let me in, but they brought everything out for me to see. And it was extraordinary to come across such a beautiful archive. So they record every single word that's ever uttered. And somebody one day should do a sort of language and ideas research on how our ideas and our language has changed over the last 70 years. Maybe they have already, but I think it would be fascinating. Maybe there should be a language and ideas test before you're allowed into the Rajya Sabha. Maybe that's a good idea. But in 1952, this is what Prithvi Kapoor said in Rajya Sabha, and it's recorded. And he said, "Theatre is a wonderful thing. It is the greatest temple on earth. In that temple, Hindu, Muslim, Christian, Jew, Sikh, and Parsi all get together, and nobody comes and asks who is in the next chair. A Pandit sits next to a mullah. A communist friend may sit with a socialist friend. All sit together. That is a beautiful way of bringing people together and teaching them how to behave. They would laugh together, cry together. It is the biggest temple that could be built for the benefit of the nation." But nobody was listening. So, somebody even just today said, "Why don't we do a Prithvi Theatre in Hyderabad?" And I get really cross at that question, because why should I? Why me? Why not you? You've got Arundhati Nag here, and she's the only other crazy person I know who's gone out and done something like this. But there are not many crazy people, and we need more crazy people who'll go out there and do it. But it's tough. It's really, really difficult, and it's just not an easy thing to give birth to spaces. But I got inspiration from Hyderabad when I visited Lama Khan, I must say, and I got thrilled with being able to experience the idea of Lama Khan and then see it alive. And I love that. So for me, what I think I realized very early on in life was, okay, I wasn't sure whether I wanted to be an actress, where I wanted to be an actress, theatre, cinema, England, here. Finally, I got it. The penny fell, and I knew I wanted to do theatre, and I knew I was Indian. And I think you only really know that when you go and live abroad. And so I was clearly not English, and I then went and lived in New York, and that was wonderful study-wise for me in theatre, but this was home, and this is where I belong. And so to do theatre that I wanted to do, the environment was not exactly right. So I only did very few plays, but I realized what I have in me is the actor-manager gene. Prithvi Kapoor, Jeffrey Kendall were actor-managers. They had their own theatre company. They had their own dreams. They were directors, actors. They kept their group together. And I think that's what I love. So I think something else also happened, because I must have been 9, and somebody has to tell me to shut up, because I can go on forever. I'm going to shut up in 2 minutes, and then you can ask questions. I think I was 9 when Prithvi Theatre was being built, and it was fascinating. Breakfast table was covered with blueprints and architecture drawings, and conversations would happen. I wouldn't understand anything, but I loved it was like a jigsaw puzzle, figuring out, oh, you enter from here, and then there's a little basin there, and there's a bed there, and there's a stage here. And ever since then, I've been fascinated with architecture drawings, with the philosophy that I believe needs to go with architecture. They should be teaching architecture and philosophy as a mandatory thing together, I believe. And I think the one biggest thing we're missing in our world today are our philosophers. But I think that for me, I imbibed my mother's passion for Prithvi, and I imbibed the architect's passion. She was working with this really young architect, Ved Sagan, and their meeting and coming together was beautiful. And I think that somewhere that stayed. And I know that when I was then in India, and I must have been 20 or 21, and I was back after studying in America, and I wanted to do theatre, I was terrified of going anywhere near Prithvi, because I just thought, no, it's just too much of a responsibility, and I have not earned it. My mother had a lifetime of experience, so did my father. Who am I? Because after my mother passed away, she ran it for 5 years, then Kunal, my brother, ran it for 8 years. And very slowly, I did get involved. I got sucked in. And my father, I started with a sort of 5-point plan of 5 different projects, and all my father would say was, you find the money. So I would have to go find the money to make it happen. And then he would be there and experience each and every one of my things that I did. And he would tell me what he thought about them, which was wonderful, actually. It was just wonderful. So that was my journey with my sadness is that I think that next life, and luckily I'm Indian, so we have many lives. So next life I will be an actress, and next life I will learn how to sing, and I will cook. So there are these 3 ambitions I have. But I just want to read you something that my grandfather wrote. When he wrote, and he talked about, this is Geoffrey Kendall, and he talked about being an actor. And he said, being an actor must be the best job in the world. It combines all the things that a person need look for: health, romance, travel, the fun of the lottery, the positive tragedy of failure, and the will to overcome it. It provides good companionship and interest in literature, architecture, music, dancing, in short, just about everything that most people strive for. But the theatre is female. And like all females, she will not be trifled with. She must be grasped with both hands and given one's whole self, body, and soul if she is to be a proper mate. She must not be dallied with or neglected or flirted with, or she will bite, and that bite will never heal. This may sound over dramatic, but it is true and may be seen over and over again. And so I think that's what happened. My father was exposed at such a young age to both these wonderful crazy men in his life, his father-in-law, to-be father-in-law, and his father. And I was fortunate enough to be exposed to my father and my grandfather, Prithvi Kapoor, as I said, I discovered later through the exhibition. And I think that it's just, I was at the Jaipur Literature Festival just yesterday, and in conversation with Tom Stoppard, I was terrified of being in conversation with him because I thought I'd just get tongue-tied. Like my father's tongue turned to leather. I thought that would happen to me. But he's just such an amazingly beautiful man that he put me at ease and was fine. And I asked him about whether, I asked him many questions, but whether theatre is, whether artists need to be political. And whether they are, and how can he explain to me, because he's written it a lot, that art is necessary in our lives. And I'm not going to even attempt to say what he said, because I can't say it as beautifully as he did. But in a nutshell, what he said was, when we create habitats, when we create places to live, we make sure that all the ingredients is there. We make sure that the roads are there, the electricity, the water, the schools, everything, and people. And it's a beautiful microcosm of the world. But if you were to take out the arts and all the people that make the art and make art, it would turn into an absolute mess. And he said it would be dystopia. It would be nothing. Because you would remove imagination, you would remove metaphor, you would remove allegory, you would remove philosophy. And how can we have a world without these things? And this is what I'm actually fighting for, because we're building 100 new cities in our country, and smart ones at that, but with not much smart thought behind them. So I'm just desperate to try and make sure that we create more and more spaces for the arts, and that's what I do with Junoon. So I'm going to, at the end, just read you one thing, which is, for me, I found this, and I love it. It's called the Manifesto of the Arts, and I found it on Facebook by chance. It's anonymous. So some very clever person wrote it. And he says, culture, of which the arts are the highest expression, is but a collective means of making meaning and telling stories, of imagining, and then believing what is real, who we are, what we're doing here, and why. Our culture reflects us, how we see the world, and how the world sees us. Of course, I'll take questions, as long as they're not too many. I could take questions all night, actually, but it's terrible when you get me started talking. Yeah? Oh, you're making me point out to who to... Okay.
I'm Sangamitra Malik. It's wonderful to hear you, Sanjana.
Thank you.
I don't really have a question, but I'd like to mention something.
Yes.
One is, I did part of my schooling in Kolkata, in modern high school, and when we were doing Shakespeare, we were told that the Kendals are here and they are going to perform in our boys' school, which was then called Hindi High School. Now it's Birla High School. So we were so excited, and I am very fortunate that I saw your grandparents performing live, sitting very much in the front, because we were one of the schools who went very early. We were so excited, and we were very much in the front, and had those were wonderful, memories. The other thing is, which I would like to say, I was in modern high school. Aparna Sen was a few years senior to me, and we had a class teacher, Miss Colt, and your mother's character in 36 Chauragi Lane was based on Miss Colt. So later when I saw the film, I found that, so this is the person on whom she's, built it.
Yeah. So
these are two things which I just wanted to tell you.
It's so important to me, I can't tell you, because I really, honest to God, I don't spend 2 weeks without meeting somebody who comes up to me and says, your parents or your grandparents came to my school or my college, and my goodness. And that was so many years ago, but it was for 30 years. For an entire generation of people were exposed to Shakespeare and professional performers. And for me, that's my inspiration. So Junoon, that's what we do. We take theatre to schools and colleges and people across the country.
And then your father, I saw in the film as well.
We'll take another question. Thank you.
Thank you.
Should we take 2 or 3 questions together, and would you like to answer that?
As long as somebody clever remembers them all.
Yes. Oh. Yes. Please.
Got a pen and I should write them down.
That was a wonderful talk we heard.
Thank you.
I have a similar thing to say, like Sangamitra. I'm also from a school where every year the Kendals would come from Shillong, Loreto.
Oh my
So
God.
whenever we did Shakespeare, he would do one act from that, whether it was Merchant of Venice or A Midsummer's Night's Dream.
Scenes from
By
Shakespeare.
then, I think your father and your mother had not come, but Felicity used to come for. So it was something that we all look forward to. The nuns would be there announcing that the Kendals are coming. So it's
Thank
again reliving the whole thing after you told me about
Thank
them.
you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. And that's what happened. This company, which was 18 people, out of which 2 or 3 were taken actors from India themselves, the company dwindled and got smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller. And at the end, it was just 3 of them, Felicity and my grandparents, and doing scenes from Shakespeare. And finally, it was just 2 of them. And they still continued. My grandfather, at the age of 84, directed me in Gaslight, which Prithvi produced, a play that my parents acted in very well, actually. And yeah,
Which
but-
incidentally I saw.
oh gosh.
One more question, and I'd like to announce that soon after this session is over, Sanjana will be meeting people who'd like to actually talk to her and interact with her at the Meet the Author venue. So one more question. Here's a
I
gentleman.
love
who's
it.
been
I'm an
wanting-
author without being an author. It's so much fun.
Well, meet the artist, yes, and the author in making.
no, no, no.
Thank you for being in Hyderabad.
Ah, I love Hyderabad.
I'm a great fan of Shashi Kapoor sir. All his movies were the Kala Pattar, but New Delhi Time was one of his best movies. And then I realized, oh, Shashi Kapoor इतने अच्छे हैं, तो उनकी बेटी क्यों नहीं आई? Then the movie came, Hero Hira Lal.
Ah,
You just now said you have to come out from disasters.
yes,
Yeah,
yes,
I-
yes,
I-
yes. Thank you so much.
And being in Hyderabadi, from Nasruddin's point of view, oh, Hyderabadi bhasha bhi hoti hai. So I saw it on the first day. And the movie bombed.
Yes. But then unfortunately it was shown again and again on
Again,
television. This
correct.
was very
But the
terrible.
movie was good. Then I was thinking, ये क्या कर रही है? Actress क्यों नहीं बन रही है?
Because I was terrible. I thought I was terrible. That's when I went to drama school after that. Yeah.
But then again, you and Naida Kumanal, they never came into actual acting. But they all have the background, apart from your
Yeah,
cousins.
it was just a misfit, I think. But theatre was what, yeah, I was lucky I found theatre, I guess. If I hadn't found theatre, I know I would have been in education. It's funny, being uneducated, I would have been in education, but I'd have to go and study and do some exams, which would have been scary.
But that's exactly what you did. You took the theatre to people.
yeah.
I remember the time that it was not just the Prithvi Theatre that you populated and made completely the happening place in the city. And I understand why you like the Lama Khan, because
Yeah.
that's exactly the process that